I've been asked to share just a little bit about the idea of how we show compassion and mercy as believers. I just want to explore that for a few minutes. And to do that, I want to share a little bit of my background, my virtual background here, my story. And you have to understand, I was brought up in an Anglo-Catholic high church parish, and I loved that. And I was a server. I begged to be a server. I begged to be confirmed at the earliest possible opportunity. And had it not been for the fact that I had a priest who gave me, first of all, bad advice and was doing some bad things, if it hadn't been for that, I probably would have gone for the priesthood rather than go to America, and my life would have been completely different. But our lives are in God's hands, and he knows what he was doing. When I was at school, I was considered to be a very, very stupid person. I would sit a maths test and I would do this is an actual example. I would do the first three sums, which of course, as you know, in any test, the first questions are pretty easy and they get harder. And so I did the first three sums on this page, and to my horror, the rest of them just looked like a blur of nothingness. And so I sat there for the duration of the exam for an hour or so, and I was looking out the window, and here's my son. Let me just pause for a moment. And the virtual background wasn't working too good, and my son just come back from the library, and he looks very cool, all dressed up there. Hi, Luke. I hope you had a really good time there. He's not talking. He's the silent one right now. I was talking about my maths exam, and I can recall the trains going by, because you look to the right of my classroom window. I was sitting second row on the left. I know exactly where I was sitting. I was same age as Luke, a tiny bit older. And across the classroom, there was these big windows. And across this piece of grass, which actually I realize now was a World War II air raid shelter, because we weren't allowed to go on it. It was out of bounds. And there was a public footpath, and there was an embankment. And on top of that embankment, the trains would go by. So I would watch the trains, and I would hear the trains, and I'd look at the birds in the tree. And because I was completely bored out of my mind, I didn't have a clue how to do my maths. So the teacher came around and said, "What is this? You've only done 3 questions." And there was another chap, Colin Clarkson, who also had a learning difficulty, bless him. And he had put a couple of, he'd done more than me, he'd done 3 questions and a massive ink blot on his page. And so the teacher sent us to the head teacher's office. And I remember walking over with Colin, bless him. I wish I could roll back the ears and just give him one great big hug and say, it's okay. These guys just don't know what they're doing. They don't know how to teach. They don't care about us. But I didn't. And I remember the pale green brick walls of outside in the corridor of the head teacher's office, staring at those walls, at the bricks, for about half an hour before we were called in dread and trembling, head teacher's office, Mr. O'Sullivan. I think it was Mr. Fairweather. It's funny how Mr. Fairweather was the one who sent us to the head teacher. Isn't it funny how you can remember the minutest details of stuff when people really stick it in you and really mess your life up? Incredible, isn't it? And we're standing there on the head teacher's carpet. I'm on the left, Colin is on the right, and Mr. O'Sullivan, a short, balding man, middle-aged, with a Harris tweed suit, a horrible greeny color. He asked for us to give account of ourselves. I was completely embarrassed and completely terrified by this. And so I looked at Colin, and Colin looked at me, and we smirked at each other. because what do you do? We couldn't say anything to him. And we smiled at each other briefly. Then we looked at Mr. O'Sullivan. He said, right, so you both think it's a joke, do you? I'll show you it's not a joke. And he walked across his small study and opened up a little tall cupboard, got out a stick, a cane, and we both got whacked good across the hand several times with Mr. O'Sullivan's cane. And of course, we were mortified. I went back and told my mum. And my parents went up to school later, next day, and had it out with him. And of course, the school said, well, this is how we impose our discipline, and these children have to learn. So nothing came of that. But I'm saying that because this is a prime example of how people are mistreated and misunderstood and misread. Today, one hopes that you'd get a teaching assistant or something come in at the very least and help you and say, what is it, John, you don't understand? That's why when Luke doesn't understand something, I just say, okay, let's just go back to the basics. Let's look at the question a different way. Or, let's not stress about this right now. Let's do something different. Because I understand what it's like to be confronted with a piece of paper you're supposed to write your essay on, or you're supposed to write the answers to the questions on, and you cannot write anything because your mind is a complete blank, just like this screen. You go blank. You can't process the information. And you wonder why everybody else in the class says, right, now start writing your essay. And all the girls in the class, their heads go down and they start writing this. You can hear their scratching pen and you can almost see their mind working, tick tock, writing. And you're sitting there thinking, I don't have a clue what I'm doing. I don't have a single clue. What? And I'm thinking, if I could read their mind to find out what is it that all of a sudden they go into work mode and they're writing, and I don't know what's going on. I've never shared that before with anyone, but I'm going to tell you something else. I'm just going to get something for you, okay? Right, now, this is the back of a picture frame, obviously. I'm going to show it to you in just a moment, and there's a special reason why. At this same primary school, some people call them elementary schools, or what else do you call them? Don't know. We call them primary schools, elementary schools. This same school, I was so obsessed, if you like, with people, classmates, being friends with one another, sharing with one another, with having being a community. I couldn't put it into words. I was at this point in time 10 years old, so I'm a year older now in the same school. I couldn't verbalize that inner yearning for communion with those around me, because I was the one that was left out. I was always the one that was never picked for the football team. I was always the one that was the last one to get picked for a game at playtime. And I couldn't understand why these children were running around doing all sorts of ungodly things and looking at war comics and things, but all I wanted to be a boy that was peaceful and caring. But I couldn't verbalize any of this. But what I did, now fortunately my mum, she rescued me. And God knew I needed a godly mum. My mum rescued me because she was the church secretary, and that meant taking dictation 3 times a week from the vicar, the priest, and that also meant that she was responsible for the parish magazine that came up once a month. Back then we had a proper magazine. It used to be published on a Roneo duplicator with wax stencils, if you've ever seen them. And so you type on a typewriter, no computers back then. You type on a typewriter with this wax stencil, which has got a layer of wax, and it's got a covering paper on it, and it's got a backing paper, and it's got lots of lines on it so you know where you're at. And you put that into the typewriter, and you put it, you make sure the ribbon isn't working, and you press hard on it and it types, and you can put that on a Roneo or Gestetner duplicator, and it's like a mini printing press. So I told my mum I wanted to do a school magazine. And so that's exactly what I did. I said, I want to do a school magazine. I'm going to write it myself. Basically, so I'm going to veto anything I don't like in that magazine. I'm only going to get my best friends to write in it. I'm not going to tell the teachers. I'm not going to tell the head teacher. I'm not going to announce it to the class. I want it to be a total surprise. Me and my friends are going to do this magazine. And so I edited the magazine, and it was called Everywhere. And I ran it for 2 years, right until I left to go to high school. And believe it or not, I've got a copy of one here. Volume 1, number 3. So this would be the 3rd copy that I did. This is how you do a Roneo. This is before photocopiers. This is how you did it. I had to draw that heading. I drew it with a metal stylus by hand, direct onto a wax stencil. Everywhere, a magazine of class 3, 3P or more. That's in the olden days. Volume 1, number 3. So we got contents, editor's letter. That's me. Letter from SPG. Now, that's interesting because the SPG was the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, and it was the mission arm of the Church of England. And I was determined that all the money, this is about the only money-making venture I've ever done in my life. It actually made money every single issue, and the money goes to SPG. So we've sent all the money to missions. That was hot. Even though it was a secular school, I said, you know, I'm sorry, the money's going to missions. It's my magazine. I'll tell you where the money's going. So I was a bit of a rebel even back then. Because you're either a rebel or you sink. Did you get that? I never thought of that before. If people don't understand you, you either sink into the abyss or else hopefully become a friendly rebel. In other words, your heart attitude has to be right. It has to be a heart of compassion, mercy, and seeking truth and justice. And if your heart is seeking truth and justice, and it's open to correction, then you can be as rebellious as you like, as long as that rebellion is totally surrendered to the Lordship of Jesus Christ. So you become, don't misread me on this, so you become a vessel of Jesus. You become a follower of Christ, even if you don't understand it. And what else we got here? We've got The Problem Princess by Sheila Turton. I don't remember her. India by Maharaj bin Khan. Now, she was one of our best friends. She was one of the first Indians to come into her family was one of the first Indians to move into our neighborhood. My mum befriended her mum. Maharaj bin didn't even go to our school, but I got her to write an article anyway. Then, in the interest of fairness and inclusion, we had Alan Wilkinson, who was our best sportsman in the school. We let him do an article on the Hun cap and swimming by Yvonne Winter. Yvonne Winter was one of the girls, didn't like me very much. But I put that in there because I knew that people like sport. So instead of saying, well, I don't want anything about sport in there, I said, no, come on, Alan, can you do me an article, please? I don't know how I got him to do it, but I got him to do it. So that's how that got in there. What else do we have? Books by Linda Jaggs, Lynn Osborne, Art Warren, and Patricia Wilshire. I remember these names. Riddles and Jokes by Caroline Nolder and Steve Pettit. Caroline was something else. SPG House by John Ruffle. There is my story about going up to London and giving them the check for the previous edition, and they gave me a tour of their mission up in Tufton Street next to Church House. You Anglicans will know what I'm talking about. And People in the Congo by Ian Rains. And then, come on, focus up, please. Focus. Right, it's not cooperating. Adventure Story by June Alsford and John Ruffle. And then the bit I liked the least, Tidbits Everywhere, which was little bits of jokes and things. There it is. I've got 3 copies in this picture frame. I'm not taking it out the frame today. Maybe another time I will, and I might read you an article. But I'm telling you that thanks to my mum, that changed my life, because I was later in life diagnosed as having dyslexic indicators and very short-term memory that is associated with dyslexia, which made that was the hardest time. When in my teaching career, that was the hardest thing for me, dealing with short-term memory. That was a real challenge for me, remembering students' names. I was often terrified of forgetting people's names. But one thing about that magazine is my mum would make me, I'd write it in longhand. My mother would type it, but she'd only type exactly what I had written. So as soon as I came upon a spelling mistake, she'd stop typing and she would make me correct my work. And my goodness, it was painful. Correcting my own work was so painful. Sometimes I just wanted to give up, but my mum would never let me. And to this day, I can remember being in the basement of the church hall and the Romeo machine running off 100 copies, and it was about 8 pages, and having to collate them on, laying on the floor, sitting on the floor, all these pages, and collating them and stapling together. And the first issue, which would have been when I was 9, the first issue, I had 100 of them printed up at the church, and I carried them into school before school class started and put them on my teacher's desk, a pile this high of Everywhere magazine. And I thought, he is going to be so happy because I've shown initiative and really worked hard to do something for the school. When he came in, he said, "What's this?" And he got angry with me. He said, "How dare you produce a magazine without getting permission first?" I think somebody else had a word with him, because he didn't send me to the head teacher's office. He went out the room, and thinking back on it, reflecting on it, he must have got advice from the head teacher. And he said, "No, just, leave it. Don't get, it caused a problem for the staff." So after his initial anger, I never got thanks for it, never, ever. But he did allow me to sell it in the playground, and we were able to raise money for Christian missions. You got to understand, my uncle was a priest, and my one of my first cousins was not only an Anglican priest, but he was a missionary out in the Congo and the Australian outback. But my Uncle Fred, you see, I never called Uncle Fred Father Fred. All his parishioners did, of course. But to me, he was just Uncle Fred. And so right from birth, he's the one that baptized me. Right from birth, it was like my relationship with the priesthood was as family. And that's what we are. I want to close this. I've gone on a long time, but I want to close this by telling you that church is family. And family is at its best when it meets together. It's not necessarily at its best when it meets on formal occasions like baptisms, confirmations, weddings, and funerals. A family is best when it's at peace and harmony, sitting around the kitchen table. Because from the kitchen table, that's the day-to-day living life that we all have. And the problem we have in our churches today, I'm saying that in general, across the denominations, is that we know how to perform on Sunday. We know how to put on a good face. Women, we know how to put on lipstick. Men, we know how to not swear when we go into the church. But that's not daily living. Daily living is when, like last night, we woke up at 2 a.m. because Luke wasn't feeling too good. And you comfort your son and pray for him. Daily living is when I realize that right as I'm going to bed, or I've just gone to bed, and I realize the bin man's tomorrow morning, I'm not taking the trash out. And I get out of bed, go downstairs and take the rubbish out, put the wheelie bin out by the curb. Daily living is when I'm about to eat that last fish finger and I think, wait, my son might want that. Daily living is doing what my friend in the parish does very well, litter picking. I'm so glad he's doing that, because Gladys and I used to do a little bit of litter picking before I got ill. And bless him, Anthony's taken that job and taken it into the stratosphere and done so well. So thank you for that, Anthony, for taking over that job. The same with the church toilets. They used to be absolute disaster zone. It looked like a war zone from Ukraine almost. It was almost that bad. And I'd go in there once in a while. If I use the toilet, I think I can't leave it in that condition. And I'd do a little bit of a cleanup. But Anthony's come along and he's made that his mission to make it spotless. And I want to thank, I'm going public with Anthony. I want to thank Anthony for doing that. And I think it's a wonderful achievement that he's done that and he's continuing to do it. And I want to pray the grace of God on you, Anthony, so that you might have the strength and the wisdom to continue doing these small things that are actually so important. So it's in the small daily things where our spirituality really takes its root. And in conclusion, and to continue the theme that I started just a couple of minutes ago, the real church is when we meet in the home. And I said this during the synodality that Pope Francis put forward. We were all asked at the parish level to put our views, and we had 5 minutes to talk. And in my 5 minutes, my message was, the church desperately needs renewal. We cannot have business as usual. We need renewal. And that renewal will only come if we have relationship and friendship. And the way to do it is to have informal home group structures, not a formal thing like Father XYZ said we have to read this passage and then we've got 3 questions to answer. That's not a home group. That's a study group. Home group is where somebody goes in the kitchen and says, do you mind if I make a cup of tea? Or somebody says, guess what? I brought a pizza. Or guess what? Somebody says, look at this beautiful Filipino food. Anybody want to try it? A home group is multicultural. It doesn't look on one person higher than the other. And when people have needs or difficulties or challenges, instead of pointing the finger, we circle the wagons, as the Americans say, and cover them with prayer, understanding, give them a good meal, give them a bed to sleep in if needs be, give them clothes, whatever it takes, give them emotional comfort, make it a safe space. Our homes have got to be a safe space, because a lot of people are living in homes and they're not safe for no fault of their own very often, usually no fault of their own. They don't have a safe space. And so if you have a safe space as a home, and this is where your ministry can develop in seeking, how can I pastor one-to-one? How can I pastor my neighbor? How can I care for my neighbor? How can I love my neighbor? How can I share the word of God with my neighbor? How can I show them that Jesus really cares and loves them, and that the idea they have of what the church looks like is probably a fake caricature of something that doesn't even exist except in their own mind. And here is the kingdom of heaven come upon earth through Jesus Christ, and it's in my front room and it's in your front room. Brothers and sisters, I don't know where I've gone on this. This is a half-hour talk. I was asked to do it, and I'm very happy to do it. I might have raised more questions than I've answered, but may the Lord bless you. May his face shine upon you. May he give you your peace, and may he have mercy on you and all those whom you love, now and forever. In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. This is Johnny Ruffle. Thanks for the privilege of sharing with you today.